Guy, good morning.
David, good morning to you.
We're speaking to you today in the headquarters of Santori Lucasade Ribena, in just outside of London. But in a previous existence, you had another role to play, when for 5 years you were chairman of the Pharmaceutical Industry Security Forum.
Yes, indeed.
At the time, this was in from about 2009 to 2014.
Correct.
And this was at a time when the pharmaceutical industry itself, plus a range of other major significant industries, were undergoing an unprecedented level of attack from what were called single-issue pressure organizations. Other people called them terrorist groups, which were developing innovative ways of attacking organizations they didn't like. Given that at the time you were head of security at Huntington Life Science, which was a specific target for these groups, would you like to tell us a bit about the background to that and what the situation was in that period from a security management perspective?
Yeah, if only it was just security management. I think very much the phrase business survival and business resilience would come to mind. Yeah, I was director of security and operations there, which was helpful because it covered off the risk piece as well. So, except for us, the risk was very much there and very much in our faces, not just for the organisation, but across the industry sector that we were part of. And indeed, as you quite rightly pointed out, it pretty much contaminated every other industry sector. Again, not just in the UK, but across Europe and indeed the rest of the world. I would certainly argue that it was the first global single-issue extremist campaign that was successfully exported across into Europe, into the mainland United States, and indeed globally with various outpoints of the pressure groups that were involved, as you pointed out. So it was a real challenge, and it was one that had sort of predated 2009. So there'd been a very focused series of campaigns against a variety of sectors, whether it was the academic sector in terms of research.
Well, so we're talking about research and specifically the use of animals in pharmaceutical and medical
research and the sort of aspects there as well. And very sadly, that then, of course, narrows it very much down to a single point. But as I often point out and when I lecture, it's so much more than just animal rights. And I don't belittle the just animal rights because it had a significant and huge impact both on me and my colleagues and the industries I was helping to support at that particular time. But very much part of the single issue extremism aspect, the theatre that was there then at that occasion. It was very much around a massively sustained campaign of its time, and I again always often use the phrase, it was of its time a perfect storm. Everything aligned and came together in the stellar community of the stars to present this unprecedented issue. Obviously for the Huntington Life Sciences group of companies, but actually so much bigger. It was very much the pharmaceutical sector, the life sciences sector, the charities sector. Don't let us forget that the charities such as cancer research were being heavily targeted, and of course academic institutions such as Oxford University, Cambridge University. So it was much broader, but focused in that particular period of time leading up to my taking over as chair of the Pharmaceutical Industry Security Forum as a much wider impact in terms of what it was doing. And it manifested itself in a number of ways. I've made reference to the fact it was a global campaign, but it was that and so much more. So we had the first real global campaign working with social media, the early days of social media. The first real global campaign of extremism that brought into play the media and utilised the media as a weapon or as an attempted weapon. It also brought in international mobility. It brought in successful tactics of transportation and the ability to cross international borders. And how was that responded to, and what did I and my colleagues and the teams we had supporting us try and do, was to take this effectively from what was perceived as a Huntington Life Sciences problem. And unwittingly and by default, we became the global leaders and experts in how did we address this situation. So the principal pinch point was allegedly and supposedly the issue around animal research and Huntington Life Sciences, but actually it became so much more.
If I can just give some context to this, because you've mentioned things like transportation and transglobal. One of the tactics, and actually probably maybe the most successful tactics, was for hunting shack, stop hunting animal cruelty, to not only go against Huntington Life Sciences, but what we call secondary and tertiary, third level suppliers. So if you, for example, used a local cab company, that taxi company would be considered as a legitimate target for attack. I know, for example, that there was a yacht was burnt, which was a famous case in America, purely because it had been hired by people who had shares in Huntington Life Science. I know, for example, in the Caribbean, an air company that had been used to transport fruit, I believe, to somebody who supplied fruit to Huntington Life Science. That air company then became a target itself. That must have put incredible pressures upon you.
Oh, phenomenal pressures. And it was anybody and everybody was targeted. You're absolutely right. I mean, Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, which is quite parochial to say Huntingdon in the sort of centre of England. But I've already pointed out this was Shack, Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, but it was global. It was a global brand. Actually, it became the first global extremist brand.
Yes.
People being paid, people having phenomenal amounts of funding. So funding revenues coming in from all over the world by people who are putting their hands in their pockets because, understandably, we all have a legitimate care and concern for the welfare of animals. But subverting that message to actually advance violence, terrorism, extremism, and to fund those activities. And I think when we look at things like you referenced the boat, several boats, the head of the New York Stock Exchange had his boat blown up in New York. I'm not educated enough, you've used tertiary. Actually, the targets went down to quaternary, to 5, 6, 7 levels. An example I would use was a logistics network that supplied us, also supplied a well-known food retailer in the UK. That then logistics provider had their offices in a facility in Manchester, which was owned by an investment company that was insured by another insurance company, and suddenly all the franchises of the insurance company were being targeted and on occasions firebombed. And on occasions the management company and the investment company were told that this was bad, unethical investment. But actually it wasn't just a letter, it was actually physical manifestation of threats. So posses of extremists arriving at houses at 2 o'clock in the morning, throwing rape alarms into gutters, daubing graffiti, dumping 5,000 or 6,000 leaflets about the incumbent transgressor of the insurance company, the logistics company, the investment...
Incumbent transgressor, I think, is a bit highfalutin for us.
Right.
Can you try and break it down a bit more so we can get slots rather than...
I think what we've got is a series of people who were perceived, rightly or wrongly, but misidentified at supporting animal research in whatever shape or form that took, whether it was Huntington Life Sciences, whether it was GSK or AstraZeneca, whether it was Cambridge University. All of these providers, at whatever level they were involved in a perceived or real chain, at whatever level, were targeted, and targeted heavily. And there was much physical manifestation and much ideological and psychological intimidation. So again, this program that was this global brand became known in many countries for actions against people, actions against families, And it manifested itself in a variety of fantastic tactics on their part, which have now been successfully adapted almost in the global handbook. We talk about the terrorist handbook of how to make a homemade bomb or a bacteriological device. Think that in terms of extremism. And I'm always uneasy because we call it extremism. You're absolutely right, David. It is terrorism. In my world, it's terrorism. But it's just how that is interpreted for the terms of the media. And in fact, one of the reasons that it was called extremism very, very early on, some 30 years ago, was, guess what? It has an effect on insurance. So if you call it extremism, you can kind of mitigate against it. If you call it terrorism for obvious reasons, there are exclusions to what you have.
It's interesting because I did a study on SHAC and its methodologies for my master's dissertation. And one of the points I made was it was actually one of the very, very first successful terrorist or extremist organizations in that it was able to influence policy and strategy. I'll give you two examples. The New York Stock Exchange pulled the public listing of Huntington Life Science with, I think, minutes before it went live, which obviously had an incredible corporate shock.
Yep.
So it was able, as you say, this very parochial local organisation was able to reach across to the New York Stock Exchange, put the squeeze on, and impact absolutely on their decision making. Back in the UK, because Huntington Life Science, which was a major part of the major pharma sector, was not able to get insurance, the British government acted as the insurer of last resort, and that they personally underwrote the insurance of Huntington Life Science. For a bunch of local thugs, that's not a bad effect, is it?
No, it's not, and I think I bow to the fact that, and I've read your master's thesis on this, and I agree with much of what you've said, and I think, all of what you've said is relevant. It's interesting that a bunch of thugs is sometimes the easy way we would wish to identify them. I think, yes, they were, undoubtedly, but also incredibly sophisticated. All the weaknesses and strengths they had were there in abundance. So the ability to be highly organised, motivated, ideological, passion, but at the same time incredibly stupid, in making some nonsensical decisions and some real own goals. You know, a decision to exhume somebody's remains from a graveyard plot was a game changer because it changed the perception of the world's media, not just the UK and European media. But I think fundamentally
actually, they exhumed somebody's grandmother's
remains.
Remains even worse. Yes.
And lo and behold, guess what? That was replicated many years later with a major global pharmaceutical business based in Europe, where guess what? They did exactly the same thing alongside burning down the hunting lodge belonging to the chief executive officer at that particular time. So it has caused horrendous implications, but the agenda was so much more. The agenda was, certainly in the UK, an anarchic agenda which was based around trying to destabilise government, which manifested itself in simple things like the local police law enforcement group in that particular county of the UK, and indeed several counties, which was all around trying to bankrupt that police agency. You're quite right to point out that much of the support network at the time for Huntington specifically was bankrolled through the government, or insured by the government would be a better phrase. And I think that support was absolutely key. But it wasn't until the intervention of the large multinational pharmaceuticals who said to the UK government, you know, if you don't get an angle on this, not just in the UK, but with your partners around the world, this is a global problem. The domino effect is here. The buck stops here. You have to get into a position where you deal with this, because otherwise people were going to decamp from the UK. R&D, research and development in Europe and the UK is phenomenal. And indeed globally it's phenomenal. And if you seek to construct barriers against that, the economic impact is massive. And I think you've got to take into account how do you deal with that. And we didn't have. So going back to the risk perspective, this risk had been there for many years. It wasn't an emerging risk. What took everybody on was the fact that a number of people, this band of thugs, were able to coalesce into a group of people that at its height was no stronger than about 1,000 people, with a core of about 200 people prepared to go to prison, and indeed did go to prison for significant penal sentence.
Somebody got 14 years, I think, for arson, didn't they?
Some got 14 years for arson, some got 12 to 13 years for conspiracy to cause issues to the public, and the public were our members of staff and those of our aligned members of staff. And I think that was a message that got lost very early on in the day, which is this was perceived as the people that are being transgressed against are these people who work for Oxford University or work for a pharmaceutical or work for a Huntingdon Life Sciences or the many competitors that Huntingdon has, of which, interestingly, they didn't have the same problems. So 7 or 8 Huntingdon-type organisations existed at that particular period of time, only Huntingdon to allow for consistency about the ethics of animal rights and animal welfare.
Sun Tzu will tell you, if your forces are weaker than those against you, be focused on a single point.
Yeah, and it was very, very single and very, very targeted opportunity targeting that went through. So I think it was trying to get the message across that said, you know what, these are not just employees, these are not just staff. And this is something I hold very dear to the work I currently do and have always done. It's about our people. It's about protect, preserve, and fundamentally define the right of our people to be in a safe and secure environment. And that doesn't matter whatever level of opportunity or job or profession that you are in. And I think it was getting the world, and I say that advisedly, it was getting the world media and certain political structures within the European Union, North America, the Middle East and the UK to understand that this was about an anarchic element within a specific target group, but actually those people who were being targeted were you and I. I worked for them. But for you, by association, if you had any association, they were members of the public. They were in a democracy. They had every right to protection. And that protection wasn't there. I go back to my perfect storm statement. There was no unified law enforcement element within the UK. There was no unified law enforcement approach to extremism in Europe. And one of the things I do and am proud of is the fact that through much work, both with my work in the Pharmaceutical Industry Security Forum, our work in the Pharmaceutical Industry Security Forum, and indeed in the European equivalent, we worked tails off. We strove strenuously to get to a point where we had Europol and international police agencies at conferences. So we got this onto the agenda. We got this onto the agenda at Brussels and at Strasbourg with the European Parliament, with all the attendant challenges that comes with that. But we got profile, and we turned this and we subverted it. And we went from being passive and defending and being reactive to being proactive. But you can't just do that with security. You can't just do that with risk. That comes back to having the engagement with the C-suite, the E-suite, and actually so much more. You need politicians on board. And politicians have an agenda. This was all happening on a government at the time that had been elected in the UK on a manifesto that said we will stop all experimentation on animals. That same government, we talk about governments and U-turns, that same government executed a U-turn, a big U-turn, and became absolutely prevalent in building resource into the UK law enforcement and translating that into Europe and translating that into North America and South America and the rest of the world. And I'm sure your thesis will tell you that that's quite a fundamental piece of work. So of all the things that I was involved in, probably proudest moment, and I feel hopefully I achieved something for my colleagues and for the people I worked with in terms of punitive legislation, appropriate legislation and sentences for terrorism, was to actually get this onto the agenda of the world stage and to put in place appropriate control measures. That's all we were asking for. A level playing field, an opportunity to be fair to people on the right side. Everybody has an opinion. Everybody has a democratic right to express that opinion.